Okay, thank you very much. Since I have very little time to present a lot of slides, and I do have a lot of data and slides, I'm going to jump right into it. Sustainable Economy or Social Collapse is the title. And of course, if you're here listening to this lecture, I'm pretty sure you're aware of the basic facts behind climate change. I want to start with the most basic diagrams. In 2016, the countries of the world signed a Paris Agreement in which everyone accepted that we should reduce greenhouse emissions, which hasn't happened. So we all know that since 2016, CO2 emissions have in fact increased rather than decreased. And if you look at the data that comes out of the International Panel for Climate Change, which is a UN body of experts of climate change, what they're telling us is that we're actually headed for a warming of about 2.8 to 3.2 degrees. So what we would need would be limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade compared to the beginning of this period of warming, and that's not happening. We are headed for probably double that because of the increase in climate gases that are basically greenhouse gases. That is the problem that I want to address. That's the most recent data. So if you look at the last couple of years, you'll see that fossil carbon actually is increasing in spite of the fact that every single country of the world has signed this agreement. And that's just basically not working. Another way of approaching the problem is that there is something called the biocapacity of the world, and we exceeded as a global society, we exceeded the global biocapacity of the world sometime in the 1970s. So most of you were actually not even born then. You were actually born into an era where we had already exceeded the biocapacity of the world. And that's just another way of approaching it. Now, one thing that not too many people know, but I think is a really, really crucial fact, is that you see all these renewable energy forms around the world. You see the wind turbines, you see the solar panels, and we tend to assume that these things have replaced fossil energy. So that we are headed towards an era where we are gradually replacing fossil sources of energy with renewable sources. And that's not happening either. What is happening is that we are introducing more and more renewables, but these are not replacing fossil sources of energy, they're coming on top of it. If you actually look at the data, you'll see that there has not been a reduction of fossil energy simultaneous with the introduction of renewables. The two things were happening at the same time, i.e. it was coming on top of fossil energy rather than in place of it. Now, this is the key equation. So I think the most crucial thing, if you want to understand the issue of climate change, I think, to me at least, this is the key equation. How much greenhouse gas emissions do we have? How do we know how much greenhouse gas emissions we have? These are the factors that play into it. The number of people, how many people live on the planet, multiplied by the GDP that is consumed, so that's our level of consumption. So each person has a certain degree of consumption, which we can measure with the degree, a personalized GDP figure. You multiply that by the amount of energy that is consumed creating that unit of GDP. And you multiply that by the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of energy. It looks complicated, but actually it's quite simple. How many of us are there? How much do each of us consume? How much energy do you need to create that unit of energy? And how greenhouse gas intensive is that form of energy? Yeah, makes sense. That's the key equation. Now, what I want to GDP is gross domestic product. It's basically the amount of produce that you create in the economy. So the number of Dreher beers that you drink, for instance, or the amount of kilometers that you drive your car, or, you know, it's an aggregate measure of all the output in the economy. It's basically economic output. You can measure that per person, or you can measure that per country, or per city, or anything, yeah? Well, that's your basic equation. So what I want to do now is I want to take a look at all these different factors and ask the question, what are the trends in these respects? What are the trends in population dynamics? What are the trends in GDP dynamics? What are the trends in renewables, etc.? And this is a breakdown. So actually, if you look at all the factors, this is your breakdown. I think this is a very, very important figure because it shows you that some things have increased greenhouse gas emissions. Most importantly, you have population, which plays a positive role in the sense of it increases. Actually, I should say it's a negative role because it just makes things worse. It actually, the growth of the global population has contributed towards having more greenhouse emissions. GDP also. So you have people consuming more people consuming more. What was negative, that's below the zero line. You have energy per GDP, so we're requiring less and less energy per unit of GDP. And we are creating units of energy with less and less CO2 emissions. So these two are the negative factors, and those two are the positive factors contributing towards more greenhouse gas emissions. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's your big picture there in terms of what's happening, and the outcome is still positive. So overall, if you add everything together, even though we signed this agreement in 2016, we're still in the positive. Now you can break this down according to geographical areas, and what you see is some areas are decreasing, but China's increasing like crazy, which would make some people blame China. You look at this figure and you're tempted to say, well, it's all China's fault. But actually, most of what is being produced in China is consumed by you. So actually, yes, it's made in China, but it's not consumed in China. The other thing is that line called international shipping and aviation, that's transporting that stuff from China to here. So basically, it's very hard to break it down according to regions because it doesn't get consumed where it gets produced. That's a complication. Global material use. You tend to think that, because climate change isn't the only thing that's happening, greenhouse gases, we also have material consumption. And you tend to think that the world is dematerializing, i.e. that we're using less and less materials. Actually, that's not true. We're using more and more materials. We're way over our global footprint. And in the last couple of years, or decades, I should say, we were actually rematerializing rather than dematerializing. So we're going to run out of materials sooner or later. That's another issue, that we're just using too much stuff to produce stuff, basically. And then we come to this idea called climate justice, which is, okay, but who's to blame for all of this? And there is the previous graph was what's happening now. So where I showed you China, that was about who's producing the greenhouse gases now. But another approach is historically who's been producing. So cumulatively over time, which countries have produced most? Well, it's by far the United States, which has produced most historically. But next up, you have the European Union. And then you have Russia and the rest of Europe. And actually, China is still far away in terms of historical production. So there's two different approaches, the current production and the historical production. The other thing is when you produce GDP, and this goes back to your previous question about GDP, who actually benefits from GDP? Because we're not all consuming exactly the same amounts of GDP. Globally speaking, the top 1% produces that much GDP, actually consumes that much GDP, and the rest of the global society consumes much less than that. So it's an unequal distribution of the consumption of GDP in recent years. So whenever we think, okay, well, if GDP increases, everybody lives better, yes, but the top 1% lives a lot better, and the rest of us live a little bit better. So it's actually quite unequal. This is one of the most famous graphs. Who's responsible today for what percentage of global greenhouse gases? And what you see here, this comes from Oxfam, the top 10% of the world, in terms of income, consume almost 50% of all greenhouse gases. The top 10% are responsible for almost half of all greenhouse gases. The top 20% of global incomes are already responsible for almost 2/3 of all greenhouse gases. And for the bottom 50%, you're left with no more than 10%. This is what we call the champagne glass distribution. It's the easiest way to remember it. It looks like a champagne glass. So top 20%, and most Hungarians and definitely most Europeans actually fit into the top 20%. So, you know, this is where we are, right at the top. We are mostly responsible for most of that, the greenhouse gases. The poorest 50% are only responsible for 10%. So it's really, really unequal. This is why we talk about climate justice. Now, those people who argue for capitalism argue for endless growth. I'm going to try to prove in a moment that capitalism is all about growth. And if you believe in capitalism, you believe that growth will never end. The only problem with that is that there is nothing in the world, neither in nature nor in society, which has an exponential growth that doesn't stop. Everything in the world becomes what is called a sigmoid or logistic distribution. I grew quite fast when I was a kid, but I stopped growing. I don't grow forever. Cities grow fast, but cities don't grow forever. Trees grow fast, forests grow fast, but they don't grow forever. Everything in the world stops growing at some point. So you cannot expect society to keep on growing and growing and growing. I'm going to jump to, this. I think this will convince a lot of you. Imagine we had a 3% GDP growth rate year after year after year, which is quite average. So if you look at the historical record of the last 30, 40 years, this is roughly the rate of GDP increase in the last couple of decades. If we continue to have 3% growth in the global economy year after year after year, we would multiply the global economy 11 times over by the end of the century. So in your lifetimes, potentially, hopefully, we would multiply the global economy 11 times over simply with a GDP growth rate, global GDP growth rate of 3%. And we're talking about a global economy which already produces more greenhouse gas emissions than we can bear. This is why we signed the climate agreement. Now, is this going to happen? I don't think so. So if you're told that it's unrealistic to think about stopping growth, if you're told that it's unrealistic to stop thinking about ending capitalism, show them this graph. Because I think what is unrealistic is this. To believe that for the rest of this century, every single year, we're going to grow 3% and then 3% and another 3%, and we're going to multiply the global economy 11 times over, I think that is unrealistic. That's just not going to happen. We're going to have collapse before we're going to have this happening. Now, let me come to this, because I keep mentioning capitalism, and I was listening to the previous discussion, and the usual definition of capitalism is a system where you have private property and you have market competition. That's what most people believe is the definition of capitalism. That's just simply wrong. If you think about it, was there private property in ancient Rome or ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia? Yes. You just have to go to a museum and you'll see it on any picture or relief. there was already private property before capitalism. Capitalism's only been around for 500-600 years, so that's the first mistake that a lot of people make. They assume that capitalism's always existed. No, actually capitalism was created about 500-600 years ago. And prior to capitalism, there was already private property. Were there markets before capitalism? Of course there were. Once again, you only have to go to a museum and you see that there were markets in ancient Mesopotamia. So both markets and private property had existed prior to capitalism. Actually, you can make the argument that capitalism is about limiting markets rather than enhancing markets. There is actually a guy who makes that argument, a French economic historian called Fernand Braudel, who actually says, well, what is new about capitalism is exactly the fact that they're trying to limit markets. The British East India Company, the Hudson Company, the British Petroleum, which overthrows regimes in the third world, where you need Iran as an example, but many others. That's about buying the state, capturing the state, and using the state to limit competition. That's what capitalism is about. So where you have competition is small and medium-sized enterprises which really compete with each other, but they don't grow. That's not capitalism. They had existed prior to capitalism. The novelty of capitalism is exactly the large corporations which limit competition. So if that is not the definition of capitalism, what is the definition of capitalism? What is the novelty of capitalism? It's growth. It's eternal growth. That's Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, who said, well, it's all about reinvesting profit into growth. Growth is the definition of capitalism. There had not been an economy before just so keen on growth. So you actually, I need a microphone. So you would actually, if you looked at the history of GDP, you would see that it's flat, 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 flat for a long time, and then it starts growing and there's an exponential growth in it. That's what capitalism is. So capitalism is actually all about growth, and if you believe that you can continue this 3% growth year after year after year, multiplying the economy 11 times over, that would be capitalism. I just don't think that this is going to happen. It's just not realistic. So what we do need is degrowth. We have to realize that the economy needs to stop growing, which of course is a huge threat because people assume that growth will give you better living standards. And that was the case before in the 20th century. For a large part of the 20th century, whenever there was GDP growth, almost everybody benefited. But as I tried to show you before, this is no longer the case. This is the graph here about who has benefited in recent years, from 1980 to 2016. This is who benefited from GDP growth. So it's not even true anymore that everybody equally benefits from growth. The top 1% benefit from it, but still people perceive degrowth as a threat. So it's not easy to convince people that we need degrowth. But I believe the alternative is not growth. So the comparison that people always make is we either have degrowth, which is controlled stopping of growth, or we continue to grow. And of course, if this is the competition, then a lot of people will say, well, I opt for the second one because I believe I want to have a better life. But this isn't really the real contrast. The real comparison is we stop growing in a controlled way, or we face collapse. If you believe you can multiply your global economy 11 times over and not face climate change and not face the exhaustion of materials, of raw materials, I think you're incredibly unrealistic. You're not looking at the figures. So the alternative isn't to continue to grow. The alternative is economic collapse. So what we need is we need to create an economy where it's okay not to grow. Of course, that requires a lot of redistribution. So the reason why a lot of people are opposed to degrowth is they realize, obviously, the fact that if you don't grow anymore, you need social redistribution. And of course, in recent decades, what's been happening is if you allow everyone to grow a little bit, they won't criticize the fact, they won't even be aware of the fact that the top 1% grows much faster. Once you stop growing, once you're conscious about stopping economic growth, everyone's going to start thinking about, okay, but how do we distribute the existing size of the economy? Which, of course, is extremely political. And we don't want, if you're at the top, you don't want people to think about that. So there's a lot of interest against controlled degrowth. The problem is that the alternative to controlled degrowth is economic collapse, is climate change, and what's going to happen, and I'm just going to show you a couple of slides, last couple of slides, which is going to indicate to you, what is going to happen. We're not going to bake. So I think one problem that the green movement created in the last couple of decades is that you always sort of imply that what's going to happen is that we're all going to bake. Before we bake, there's going to be social collapse. And that's kind of already happening. Take the example of Syria. Syria was a country of 4 million after the Second World War. They grew to 22 million. Remember my equation, population growth. They grew from 4 million to 22 million. And there, the amount of land which is available for cultivation actually decreased because of climate change. So you have more people, less arable land. What do you have? You have a civil war. And that's the recipe that's repeating itself over and over and over. So you have more and more migration, which is threatening cultural clashes, because you have people from other parts of the world trying to get to the richest countries trying to close off from this migration. But of course, there's only so much that you can do to prevent this. It's not, if 2015, 2016, Europe faced a climate migration of about 1.5 million people. Potentially, according to Gallup, and Gallup has a poll on potential migration, we are facing hundreds of millions of people planning to make a move away from countries which become uninhabitable. The largest countries in the world are going to be places like Nigeria, because they have huge population growth, they don't have the economic growth to match it, they're going to try to move away from there. And if we have hundreds of millions of people trying to get to the United States, trying to get to Europe, are you going to solve it? Are you going to solve it with a fence, like Viktor Orban wants to do it? Or are you going to solve it with Wir schaffen das Willkommenskultur, like Angela Merkel tried to solve it? Neither of the two is going to work. It could work for 1.5 million, but it's definitely not going to work for hundreds of millions of people. So you're going to face economic collapse before you face the end of capitalism. That's one way to try to go. So you have this is what we have now. We have a walled world. We have some parts of the world which have effectively been walled off from the rest of the world. If you're lucky, you live on the colored parts of this. If you're unlucky, then you live on the gray part of this map. But you're trying to get from the gray part to the green part. And that's more and more the sad reality of our global world today, and it's going to be more and more of it. Forested areas, but let me just spend the last 1 or 2 minutes trying to answer the potential question, because I know some of you are thinking this. Yes, but how are you going to convince the rich people to give up growth? Because that's the kind of question that comes to your mind when you listen to a lecture like this. Yeah, okay, it's easy to convince the poor, because the poor have everything to gain. But how do you convince the rich who have everything to lose? Well, first of all, the really rich are the top 1%. You're never gonna convince them. So you might as well just give up on the top 1%, because they don't have an interest in this. Who you're really trying to convince is the top 20%, which is effectively us. How are you gonna convince them that stopping growth isn't gonna send you back to the trees? Because that's the kind of idea that a lot of people have. If you stop growing, you're gonna send people back to the trees to live like monkeys before. You actually literally get that critique from a lot of people, that degrowth people want to send us back to the trees. Well, we obviously don't want to do that. If you look at the actual data on life satisfaction versus GDP, what you see is that GDP growth gives you a better standard of living for a while. And that's quite understandable, because if you don't have a home to live in, if you don't have food to eat, if you don't have, heating or cooling or a toilet, sanitation, schools, hospitals, obviously GDP growth at the beginning is going to give you a lot more of that. But then there comes a point after which this is no longer true. So you keep on increasing GDP, and you're actually causing more problems for yourself than you're solving. Because you might be able to buy the next washing machine, but I actually bought a washing machine which has 7 programs on it, and I only use 1. So why the hell did I have to work probably weeks, or at least days, but probably weeks, to buy a washing machine where I use 1 program out of 7? And most people only use about 2. So you're actually causing more problems, more stress, more pollution, more traffic jams by producing that GDP, much of which you actually don't need. So the overall balance tends to even out. Your GDP grows, but you're not happier, which is evidenced by the epidemic of drug abuse, the epidemic of mood pills. In the United States, you have tens of millions of people who are hooked up on pills to modify their mood all the time. You have stress, this is an epidemic. Enormous proportions of Western societies are living in constant stress, depression, substance abuse. That's all the evidence that you need. People are not feeling happy after a while when the GDP grows. Actually, you would feel much happier if you didn't have polluting cars, if you didn't have traffic jams. Last sentence, the way Budapest works is most rich people live on the Buda side. In the morning, they cross 3 or 4 small bridges to the Pest side where their offices are. There's a green mayor in Budapest who's trying to close down one of those last bridges. So it's going to be a pedestrian bridge, so these car owners are very unhappy about it. In the afternoon, they go back to their homes on the Buda side. And both sides, both in the morning and in the afternoon, they spend an hour stuck in traffic. Now, don't tell me those people are happy. They're simply not happy. So producing GDP doesn't always make you happier and happier. So if you want to try to convince the upper 20%, try to tell them GDP growth is not necessarily going to make you happier. It definitely makes you happier at the bottom when you're completely poor in a very underdeveloped country. But after a while, according to empirical evidence, it doesn't. So degrowth is not a threat. Degrowth is a potential. Try to formalize degrowth. And of course, degrowth cannot be capitalist by definition. So if the definition of capitalism is growth, degrowth is not capitalist, it's post-capitalist. But it's not a threat. It's a potential new form of society which actually can make your life better and not worse.